What is Arch Linux, and is it the best distro for you? We're about to find out, so let's get started. What will we cover in this video? In this video, I want to show you what Arch Linux is, what is its current reputation among many people, what are its strengths, some drawbacks, a comparison to a popular OS that people use for robotics and other AI applications, Ubuntu server, and when you should use it in some applications that may or may not apply to you. So, what is Arch Linux? Arch Linux is a general-purpose distribution of Linux. It specializes in rolling updates. This means that instead of having specific versions like 2004, 2010, anything like that Ubuntu uses, for example, this is rolling updates. So it might push updates every week, every day. It just really depends on who's updating it and how frequently they're working on the project. It also uses a different package management system. In this case, it uses Pacman, which we will discuss later on instead of apt or yum. And it is extremely minimalistic. The basic version of Arch literally comes with just the Linux kernel and a few basic packages just to make sure it runs. In fact, Arch Linux is so powerful and so efficient that it can run on only a few MB of RAM and just like a gigabyte of storage. It's that minimalistic. So, many people, especially people who are quite accommodated to Red Hat or Ubuntu, believe that it's extremely difficult, unstable, and has poor documentation and support. And we will discuss this later, but that is actually not true. Arch Linux has been in the community for almost 2 decades now, and it has proven itself to be a very powerful and flexible OS, and despite it being a little difficult to set up, it does have thorough documentation, large community support using the Arch user repository, and it is quite professional as many enterprise organizations and systems use it on a regular basis. So, some strengths of Arch Linux. Well, Arch Linux is extremely lightweight and very powerful. As we mentioned before, it runs only on a few gigabytes of RAM. A few megabytes actually of RAM, and like 1 or 2 GB of storage. That's incredible, as most modern day operating systems take 5 gigabytes of RAM, something like Windows, and several gigabytes of storage. Windows takes roughly 20 to 25 to get it installed. It has a pretty big community, as a lot of hardcore Linux users prefer Arch Linux over anything like Ubuntu or something more proprietary. It is more flexible, and it's often called a DIY operating system because you can make your own add-ons, you can take community add-ons and put it together to make an operating system that is best for you. It makes your workflow more efficient, especially if you're in the software development field where efficient workflow is everything for user productivity. And it also has one of its biggest resources, which is called the Arch User Repository, or OR. Basically, it's a combination of all Arch users that get together and publish packages, sort of like PyPI repositories for Python, that allow anyone to publish their own packages, and so other Arch users can share them, use them, make contributions, things like that. And while the Arch documentation and wiki is quite difficult to interpret for beginners, it's extremely meticulous. So if there's any issue you're having, it probably has the answer. It just requires that expert level of thinking to interpret what it means. And Arch Linux is a complex operating system. Well, we'll discuss that in the drawbacks section. But if you know what you're doing, and if you're a Linux user on a regular basis, it can be a very powerful system for you. In the context of robotics, Arch Linux has huge advantages, as if you're running something like an artificial intelligence or some sort of algorithm that requires a lot of computation and CPU, you don't want your operating system, which is just handling background tasks, to be occupying most of that. You want most of your processing power dedicated to the task at hand, because robotics can be a very CPU intensive and very demanding application for operating systems. So something like Windows would be very difficult to perform without high power GPUs and CPUs that can handle the task. And that can often cut into the budget, be extremely expensive, etc. And so Arch Linux is a good alternative for a robust operating system that is also incredibly lightweight, so you can run only the applications that you really need and dedicate all your processing power to it. Some drawbacks do include rolling support. Now I know this was mentioned in advantages, but imagine you have some software that requires very specific versions of packages. Rolling support would actually make it very difficult for that package to run in a stable condition. This is because if you get, let's say, a rolling update that changes the version of a certain package and updates it, what's going to happen is your application might not support that version, might not support the methods in that version, so that might cause it to crash or have some malfunctions, and that could lead to instability. And this is probably where the myth came from that Arch Linux is very unstable. It's probably because these rolling updates cause dependency conflicts, and that might lead to huge software crashes that are very, very difficult to debug. So if you have one of these applications, you definitely do not want rolling support. That is going to make your debugging life so much harder. It's also pretty tough to install, although nowadays there are very powerful scripts that let you install it without much of a hassle. There are Python scripts that automate the entire installation process, so all you have to do is answer a bunch of yes or no questions, fill in your username, password, something similar to an installer on the command line, and it sets up everything for you. Before, you would have to manually partition the disks, manually install the packages, compile all the packages. It was quite difficult. And now the user community for Arch, the AUR that we were talking about, came together, made this, and now it's much more streamlined. It's also difficult to configure if you have certain packages, certain features that you want to implement. It might be a little difficult to configure, setup, and debug because of this expert Linux sort of feel or vibe that Arch Linux has. Arch Linux isn't very user-friendly, especially for beginners, because of its flexibility. Since it's so stripped down, it doesn't have that many user-friendly packages to help you install other things. You usually have to compile it from source or use Pacman to do it. So let's compare Ubuntu to Arch, because I know there are a lot of Ubuntu users who have heard a lot about Arch and are unsure whether they should switch over or try Arch. And we are one of those users. We are primarily an Ubuntu user. All of our systems, including the Magist AI that we're developing, as well as the robot dogs and everything, they all run on Ubuntu. And it is a significant consideration to change to Arch because you'd have to transfer all of your dependencies over, which can be a hassle. So let's see if Arch is the right operating system for you. If you need more support from like enterprise like Canonical, which runs Ubuntu, or you don't need rolling updates for that dependency conflict we talked about earlier, or if you're a beginner and you just want to start off with Linux, see how it works and understand that, or if you have some robotic tools or something like that that require Ubuntu as like a dependency, then Ubuntu is definitely the right way to go. You don't have much of a choice. Your hands are tied. Some disadvantages of Ubuntu do include it's still a little bit heavier than Arch. Definitely not as much as Windows or Mac OS. Those are very GUI intensive softwares. Ubuntu, even with the desktop version, it's not as heavy, but definitely not as light as Arch or Manjaro Linux, which is extremely lightweight. It's not as extensible because there are a lot of GUI packages like that are built into this, and Ubuntu has also made it a little difficult to add powerful extensions as Arch Linux does. And it's run by a single company. Now, Canonical has shown to be a very open source, very community oriented over the past few years, although companies do change, and while we aren't directly accusing anyone of anything, it is something to keep in mind if you want those decades and decades of consistent support and consistent open source formalities. That might not be guaranteed with a private company such as Canonical, which can change business strategies pretty quickly. Arch is completely community-based and community-managed, so that can be really powerful, but also a drawback depending on which way you look at it. It's fast, it's efficient, it's extensible. Pacman is also really, really powerful because As opposed to some other package managers, Pacman actually allows you to install packages from other distros. For example, if you wanted to install a Debian package into Arch, you could actually do that using Pacman. Pacman has the capability of doing that using its specific package managing systems. Pacman also draws in from the AUR, which gives you access to millions of packages, all to make your Arch life easier. Rolling updates is a slight bit of a concern, but also an advantage. It depends on the way you look at it. And while it is hard to use and hard to debug, it can be the right operating system for you. It really depends on your application. So, when would you use something like Arch Linux? Well, if you have some robust industry applications that require maximum CPU power and you are fine with doing some maintenance on it, Arch Linux is good for you. You can use Arch Linux. Ubuntu Server can be used for this type of application, and Ubuntu Server tends to be more stable as far as dependencies are concerned because of this updating system, which is separate from Arch. If you're a skilled Linux user and want to challenge yourself and open yourself to more flexibility, definitely Arch Linux all the way. And if you have performance critical tasks or security or data application tasks where security and efficiency is your number one concern, Arch is something you can consider. Although if you have huge amounts of data that are incredibly secure, like healthcare data or military data or anything like that, you might want to look into something way more professional like Red Hat Enterprise, which is completely oriented towards industry security. But Arch Linux is still something you can consider. So, to conclude, Arch Linux is a powerful operating system, and it really depends on your application and your specific requirements to see whether it's the right operating system for you. And if you guys like this video, we might make more videos on how to set up Arch Linux, how to use it, things like that. So please leave a comment if you are willing to see that. If you want to see more robotics or AI videos, subscribe and like. It definitely helps us out and keeps you in the loop when we post new videos. So good luck with your Arch journeys, and let us know in the comments if you choose Arch as an operating system for you.